Hello and welcome to Pickles Garage. Today we're working on the 1979 Sierra Grande GMC 3500. We're going to go ahead and replace our mechanical fuel pump here. This is the part, I got it on Rock Auto, where I get most of my stuff. There's the information, it's a little blurry. But basically you can get these pretty readily available most places, Parts Geek, LMC, stuff like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this replaced. It's pretty straightforward on these 350s. It's gonna be a little different if you have a different engine, but most of these square bodies for the most part are gonna be about the same, similar location, just right there. So we're gonna go ahead and get it removed, and I'll show you some tips along the way. So the most important thing when you're buying yours is you'll see that there are options for a 3 or a 2, and so one of these is a return line. So the easiest thing to do is, if you already have one, just look down and just match how many you currently have. So you see that red line right there, there's another black line, and then there's going to be the hard line that is coming up here. So mine is a 3, so that's what I replaced mine with, but just make sure you check that before you purchase it, and that will help save you some headache. So we're gonna go ahead and start removing these lines. Usually there will be a sort of like clamp. You might need some pliers just to kind of pinch it and pull back, but on both of mine those are just screws. So we're just going to get a standard flathead screwdriver. We're gonna release the tension off of it, roll it back, and then we'll be able to pull this line back. Odds are it's not gonna dump a ton of fuel, but still good just to make sure that you have a bucket handy to catch whatever falls out. So let's go ahead and start that. Now these are going to be different gauges, but it's still helpful to know which one is going to go on which, so you don't get them mixed up. But like I said, you just have to loosen these up, and then eventually this will be able to slide backwards, and I'll just be able to pull off. These are actually both really loose, which isn't great, because it could mean that fuel can leak out. It could also mean that there's air coming in. I'll show you real quick, just a quick test just to see if this has an obvious issue, like if it was a diaphragm that's been bypassed. Then I will show you what that will seem like. I'm replacing this just because it looks old anyways, and the issue that I'm having is my filter here isn't filling up, and so I'm having starting issues, and so it could very well just be a clog in the line. But because this is an easier fix than going all the way through my line and everything, I'm going to try and start here and check if it has the issue I'm talking about. These are just about loose enough, so I'm going to go ahead and pull them, and then I'm going to go underneath for the hard line. So now we are underneath. You can see the lines that I removed the pressure on those retaining clips, so they're just kind of dangling, and so I will remove them here in a moment. I'm gonna do that hard line, which is the top one right here. If at all possible, try and get a wrench similar to like this, where you can get as much grip around it as possible. They tend to be pretty worn, so if you try and get one where it's only going to have 2 or 3 points of contact, you'll run into issues. You'll just end up rounding it off. So this should be 16 or the standard equivalent, so I'm going to go ahead and get that loosened, and then we will remove the other lines so it's all at once. So we do have our hard line taken off, so that is now out of the way. These rubber hoses, a lot of the time they will get kind of cooked onto there and they get like really hard, and so you will find that a lot of the time they have a hard time losing their shape, and so it's difficult to pull them straight backwards. The best thing that I've seen is to try and rotate them, like twist them like clockwise, counterclockwise, and then that sort of breaks up what's connected to it, and then you just have to get kind of over the ridge that gets developed into it. So you'll see that kind of indent right here that ends up getting kind of hooked onto the end of it. So I'm gonna keep rotating it back and forth, twisting it. Worst case scenario, you can always cut it. That's why you usually will have tons of extra line. So if you do need to cut it, we'll be able to go ahead and replace it from there. Alright, so we got them removed. Another tool you can get is something like this. Basically, you're able to just kind of slip it in, go around, and then it helps pull it back. You can use basically just a screwdriver for something similar as well. The issue is usually if you try and use a screwdriver, it tears into this, and so like I said, if you are planning on cutting it anyways, or you're going to try and use a screwdriver, you're going to end up damaging the inside of it anyways, so I would just cut it and go from there. Okay, so now that all your hoses are removed from underneath, we're going to go ahead and remove the two 9/16 bolts that are right here. So it's just as simple as, I usually like a deep socket just so I have more room, extension, and then your basic ratchet, but that will be our next step here. So just 1 and 2. Let's get that removed. And then just naturally while I'm removing this, I just want to send a reminder that it's good to clean up any gas, wipe it off any surfaces it might have come into contact with. You don't want any potential incidences just because it is naturally a flammable liquid. So just be careful and then dispose of that properly as well. Alright, so referencing this diagram, it actually puts a couple things into perspective of just how they work. So this is a mechanical fuel pump, and so effectively as this lobe comes around, it's going to push this rod, and that is going to depress this lever, and then that is what is creating with that diaphragm the action to pull fluid into it and then push it up into where it needs to go for your carburetor. So the issue is if the diaphragm is perforated, it can no longer create that sucking action, and then it's effectively useless to use. So the way that you could test that is by essentially just pushing this down, which I'm gonna have to get my tripod because it's harder than it looks. So let me go ahead and try and get my tripod so I can show you that action. But again, this will be helpful too with installation, just because this specific engine, this 350 small block, does have this rod, and so you need to make sure that the rod is on the top of the new one instead of this being on top of it, because otherwise it'll cause damage and it won't work properly. So let me go ahead and try and get a tripod just so I can show you this. So starting with the old one, essentially what you gotta do is either on the, a workbench or something, or on the ground, you just have to press this and depress it. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to make a sort of oink sound, and I'm actually kind of feeling air along the side here, and so it definitely seems like it has some sort of perforated diaphragm because it's just not making the right noise. It's also kind of jammed up, but that's how you can kind of tell that this is no longer functioning. And I'll grab the new one just so you can hear that of what it's supposed to sound like. Alright, so naturally I care about this one a little bit more just because it's my new one, but just so you can see actually what it should sound like here. Hear that? So there must just be a perforation in the other one, but that's good. I'm glad. There was something off about it. Like it did seem like air was kind of pushing through. So it definitely seems like a perforated diaphragm, but like I said, that's much different. So this is gonna fix my problem in theory. Alright, so now we're back at the engine here, and so you'll see there's a remnant of the old gasket. We're gonna go ahead and scrape that off, make sure it is absolutely clean before you try and put your new one on, because if you create a leak, then you're gonna be very unhappy. So go ahead and clean all that gasket that's around there. You also see right in the center there is that rod that I was talking about. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that here in a second, but again, depending on your engine, you'll either be interacting directly with the lobe of the cam, or it will be a rod. And so in this case, the 350 engine is a rod. So we're gonna have to get that out of our way. Like I said, I'll dive into that in a second. Let's clean that gasket. Okay, so now we're good with the gasket removed. So now we're going to work on that rod that I was talking about. So what you will have to do is, because it kind of depends on where the lobe on the engine is, if you can actually push this rod up very far. There's different techniques to get it stuck in place temporarily, but you're going to want to make sure that you don't have to rotate your engine at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get my finger in there and then I'll try and pull up on the rod and just see how high it goes. If it goes basically to the top, then I'm good. I don't have to worry about rotating the engine. If it gets stuck anywhere like around here, then I'm going to need to just bump the engine a little bit just to get the lobe rotated so that there's not any more tension on that rod. And again, I'll kind of talk about more detail what I'm doing here, but as easy as it sounds, you just have to try and lift that rod. Try not to put too many different tools in there to get like a screwdriver or anything to push it up, because you might damage something. So it might be pretty greasy. You can dry it off with a rag or something, but just try and get it lifted up and see where it stops. Okay, so I'm not able to get the rod moved forward at all, so that must mean that the top of the lobe is actually pushing down. So just again from our diaphragm, just with how it's spaced out, that is pushing the rod downwards. So it would be normally in the depressed position for my fuel pump. So I need to rotate the engine and just kind of crank it. All you have to do is just do a quick just a quick bump, and that should move the lobe across, and that way we'll be able to move the rod up. So you're just going to keep doing that until you get more ability to lift it up. And then as far as getting a grip on the rod, sometimes you can get, you know, enough of a finger, there'll be enough of a groove to kind of push against it and lift it up, but sometimes it's a little tight in there. I don't really love using needle nose pliers just because I don't like the metal on metal. I don't want to create any sort of, you know, notches or anything in it that eventually will affect its performance or add, you know, metal to the engine. So usually if I am going to have to use a tool because I can't get a good grip on it, I do duct tape first for the first layer, and then I do masking tape around. Duct tape, once it gets oil on it, is a very slick surface, so it's going to be kind of difficult. So that's why I use the masking tape, and masking tape doesn't always hold very well on the metal. So I do duct tape first because it holds onto the metal, masking tape on top, that way it's textured and it should be easier to kind of grip the metal. And then I'll show you another way that this is useful. So I have my tool in place here that's just holding that rod up. I could probably bump the engine a little bit more because it should go even higher, but I think that's enough for me to go ahead and slide in the mechanical fuel pump without too many issues. The other thing I did want to note is I don't really have the room to do it over here, and you kind of have to take out the engine, or take off the fuel pump anyways, just to know where everything is located. But there should be a bolt up here that if you remove it and then use one of your bolts from the actual pump itself, and you just kind of hand tighten it in place with the rod up, then it will actually hold it. So that's kind of like a Chevy secret that you can do that. Again, I didn't really have the room to do it. It's really just best when your engine is out, which it naturally isn't for my case. The other tips and tricks that you can do is they talk about putting just a heavy grease on it, and so you'll be able to kind of push the rod and that'll slow the descent enough for you to go ahead and put your fuel pump in place. I don't necessarily love that because it is going to be circulating in your engine once you install it. Same concept is putting petroleum jelly, like a Vaseline almost, on this and then pushing it up, and that again slows the descent for you to be able to put it in place. But again, you're going to be circulating that in your engine. So up to you how you want to do it. I usually just get everything held in place like you see here, and then I kind of hold it with my finger, and then I quickly slide in the fuel pump, that tab in place. And it's kind of annoying. It's not the greatest way to do it by my own admission, but that way I don't have to worry about circulating anything weird in my engine. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. The other thing to keep note of is it did come with a gasket. So you're gonna go ahead and throw that on your fuel pump here. I know some people are going to be tempted to put some amount of, you know, liquid gasket, I guess you can call it, just to hold it in place. Yes, you can do that, but just keep in mind if you use too much, then it might not create that good solid seal. And then if you have the gasket stuck to it too, it's gonna bend the paper, and then you're going to have oil leaking out of the creases between the gasket and your paper. Paper gaskets, for the most part, are best served when they're against two clean, dry surfaces, and that's what the intended use is for this. Again, there's going to be a million different people that might want to argue that. You can use whatever system you want, but like I said, this is just how I have been doing it, and it seems to work fine. So there's going to be pros and cons to either way that you do it, but the way I'm going to show you is going to be without any gasket sealer. Again, this is going to be a little bit more of a complicated way to do it, just because you have to kind of have that quick motion just to get it in place. But when it works, and it's great. Whatever tips and tricks that you may have that is better than that, feel free to throw it in the comments, and maybe someone else will do it that way. So let's go ahead and dive right into it and get this installed. So as you can see, the metal rod is on there. So I am just going to line up my gasket and then we'll get it screwed in here. So like I said, you just have to kind of get your finger in there and then feel that you rest it on top of the rod, and then we'll get it lined up with the hole. Alright, so we are in. Honestly, my biggest critique with this stuff is that the bolts are just a hair too small. This new one was probably a millimeter thicker than the old one, and that is enough to cause issues because you really only can get with the lock washer on there, and if you use a new lock washer it's even worse, but you could really only get about 3.5 threads into the actual block, and so it does make it a little difficult to locate them. That's why I do recommend, you know, there's specific tools, like I think it's an owl or something like that, the AWL, but like a screwdriver works too, where basically you just push it through the hole, through the gasket, and then put it in the hole, and then just kind of locate it, and then just push it as far as you can, and that should hold up one side, and then get the other side in. You're going to want a fair amount of threads, because if you only do like one thread and then you try and push on it to get to the other one, you're going to end up ruining your threads. So I actually replaced my old ones without the original lock washers, one because they were needing to be replaced anyways, and two, just because I genuinely couldn't get enough threads on there for it to be really a good firm hold when I was doing the other side, because it's very busy in this location. So I am going to go ahead and probably get replacement bolts that are just a little longer. The threads go much deeper than the bolts dive into, so I'm gonna probably add an extra, you know, few millimeters on just to make it a little easier on myself. But for now, it is put in. But if you want to kind of skip that step, you can go ahead and get those screws. So like I said, unfortunately it's a little like playing ping pong in the dark, but if you use a screwdriver to help locate, it should make it a little easier. Just make sure that you don't lose that rod on the top of that kind of lip there. So once you hang it in there, it should be fine, but if you have to adjust or readjust and start over, make sure you're always double checking that the rod hasn't fallen off that, because it will cause damage and it won't work properly. So we're good here. We're going to dive down to the bottom to reconnect our hoses and our hardline. And then real quick, an additional tip, just because again there's so few amount of threads that are actually going to be going in the block with those original bolts. If you use a socket, even a standard socket, and the bolt is sliding into it, then you already lose all the threads that you're going to have, and you're going to frustrate the heck out of yourself, just because you're going to be twisting and twisting, and you're going to know that you're in the hole, but it's not going to be far enough in to actually bite in. So what I do is I throw balled up masking tape, fill focus, that way the depth is significantly shallower, and then usually I'll just put a little bit of tape to hold a bit of the bolt. So especially the one that's furthest to the front, you can't really get a lot of fingers on it unless you have really tiny fingers. So this kind of helps do that for you. So masking tape in there, tape, but like I said, let's go down below. So now that we're replacing these lines, we're just going to double check them real quick just to make sure if it's rotted, then we'll go ahead and cut it. Thing is, this line is like really hard, but it's the same everywhere. So even if I cut this to get rid of this formation,
it's going to be the same downstream. So this one I'm okay with. This one, it looks a little shredded, and so I might cut it just because this line is a little softer than this. So basically, I just take something like this, like metal snips, and like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and cut that little bit. The other thing is make sure that you are placing these, make sure that they're lined up so that when they're connected, it's going to have the screw where you want it. If you want to do it from the bottom, if you want to flip it around, if you want to do it from the top, whatever, just make sure it's lined up. It does create like kind of a vacuum in there. And so if you connect the line and you want to take it off again, it is a pain to pull off. So just make sure that you have it lined up the first time correctly. So let's go ahead and cut that little bit. I'll line those two back on. We'll get those screwed back in place, and then we'll do our hard line. Okay, so we have our two lines. Just remember the differences in the gauge sizes, and then we have our hard line, which is screwed down right next to them with the size 16, and we're gonna go ahead and start it up. Naturally, all the gas is kind of spilled out at this point, so it might take a little longer to get it started. I would just use some starting fluid, just spray pretty generously in the top, and then go ahead and crank it, and eventually it'll help pump all the air out of this line and get your fuel back to the carb. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so it's starting to crank and we're getting fuel into our filter here. There's a couple other things I want to check downstream, but our pump is definitely working because it is circulating fuel to the top end. So that's great. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Feel free to like and subscribe.